The Galactic Institute of Advanced Learning hung in the void like a particularly pretentious chandelier, all crystalline spires and impossible geometry that seemed designed specifically to make first-year students question their life choices, which, to be fair, was probably intentional. Nothing said elite education quite like architecture that violated 3 different laws of physics before breakfast. Our protagonist stood in the docking bay staring up at the main academic complex and wondered if it was too late to fake a sudden case of spatial disorientation. The human transport shuttle behind her was already powering down, its crew eager to drop off their cargo and get back to Earth before anyone asked them to stay for orientation. Smart people, those pilots. The docking bay itself was a study in controlled chaos. Approximately 200 species, all convinced their offspring were destined for greatness, were saying their goodbyes in languages that ranged from melodic to what sounded distinctly like industrial machinery, having a breakdown. The universal translator embedded in her temporal lobe did its best, but occasionally gave up and just labeled things as affectionate screeching, or probably not a threat. A floating orb bobbed over, projecting a holographic map that immediately reconfigured itself into something resembling Earth standard dimensions. How thoughtful, how patronizing. The orb spoke in a pleasant, gender-neutral voice that somehow managed to convey the impression it was reading from a script it found personally offensive. Welcome to the Galactic Institute of Advanced Learning, newest sentient. You are student number 7. Your species designation is human. Origin planet Terra. Classification recently contacted species. Subcategory approved for educational exchange with supervision. Please proceed to Orientation Hall 7 Beta 9, where accommodations have been made for your primitive respiratory requirements. The protagonist resisted the urge to ask if primitive respiratory requirements was really necessary, or if the orb just enjoyed being a floating jerk, probably both. She grabbed her bag, a distinctly Earth-made duffel that looked adorably archaic next to the anti-gravity luggage pods floating past, and followed the holographic arrows that appeared in her visual field. The corridors were wide enough to accommodate species that made elephants look like house cats, which meant she felt like a particularly lost child in a very expensive museum. The walls shifted colors based on traffic flow, displaying information in approximately 40 different written languages simultaneously. It was like someone had taken a migraine and made it architecture. Orientation Hall 7 Beta 9 turned out to be what the Institute generously called a multi-species compatible lecture venue, which translated to "we tried to make one room work for everyone and failed spectacularly." The seating arrangements alone were a nightmare of engineering. Benches for the humanoids, suspension fields for the gaseous beings, what appeared to be a heated rock for something reptilian, and a small pool for the aquatic delegates. The human section consisted of 3 chairs that looked suspiciously like they'd been borrowed from a dentist's office circa 9. The protagonist found her assigned seat and immediately understood why Earth had been so excited about this exchange program. They were desperate. Humanity had been part of the galactic community for exactly 8 months, which in cosmic terms meant they'd just barely stopped being the new neighbors everyone politely ignored at community meetings. Earth had resources, sure, and a decent enough population, but what they really needed was legitimacy, and nothing said legitimate spacefaring civilization quite like getting your kids into the galaxy's most prestigious university, even if said university clearly considered those kids a diversity checkbox. A being composed entirely of geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly settled into the space beside her. It spoke through a vocalization device that made everything sound like a lawsuit waiting to happen. You are the human delegate. How quaint. I am undergraduate researcher 4000 Beta from the Axiom Collective. We have studied your species. Your planet's survival rate is statistically improbable given your technological development curve. You should have destroyed yourselves 12 times by current projections. We're overachievers, the protagonist replied, wondering if this was going to be the theme of her entire academic career. The orientation proceeded with all the efficiency of a bureaucracy that had been perfecting itself for 10,000 years, which was to say it was both impressively organized and soul-crushingly boring. A holographic dean projected from some distant office because apparently physical presence was so last epoch, welcomed them in a speech that managed to be inspiring and condescending simultaneously. The galaxy's finest minds gathered here, building bridges between species, fostering understanding, advancing knowledge. Please remember that violence between students is strictly prohibited and punishable by immediate expulsion. Next slide, please. The academic requirements were posted in what the Institute called simplified format, which still required 3 different appendices and a glossary. Standard course load, 6 classes per term. Research component mandate. Cross-species collaboration projects worth 40% of final grades. Physical fitness protocols adjusted for species capabilities, and a lengthy disclaimer about how the Institute was not responsible for cultural misunderstandings that resulted in injury. Though they strongly encouraged everyone to read the pamphlet about which gestures meant friendship versus declaration of territorial warfare. The protagonist's schedule appeared in her visual feed: advanced survival protocols, comparative xenobiology, interstellar navigation theory, applied physics in non-standard environments, galactic history with focus on recent contacts, and a class mysteriously titled Practical Applications of Theoretical Impossibilities, which sounded either fascinating or like academic hazing. After orientation, she navigated toward her assigned habitat module, following a stream of students who all seemed to know where they were going with the confidence of species who'd been doing this for generations. The human contingent, all 12 of them, had been housed in the same wing, which was either thoughtful accommodation or quarantine by another name. Her room was functional, which was the nicest thing that could be said about it. Roughly 3 meters by 4, with a sleeping platform that adjusted to human specifications, a workspace that projected holographic interfaces, and a waste disposal system that came with a 10-page manual on proper usage, because apparently humanity's bathroom habits were considered exotic. The walls were set to a default, neutral gray, but could apparently display any environment from a database of 10 million planets. She briefly considered projecting an Earth forest, then decided that might be too depressing, and settled for keeping it gray. Nothing said "I'm fine with being in space" quite like aggressively neutral decor. A chime indicated someone at her door. She opened it to find another human student, looking equally overwhelmed and trying desperately not to show it. "Hey, saw you at orientation. Thought I'd check if you wanted to grab food before tomorrow's chaos starts." The cafeteria is apparently 7 levels down, and requires navigating what the map calls intuitive spatial corridors, which sounds fake but okay. The cafeteria, when they finally found it after 20 minutes of being definitely not lost, was an assault on the senses. The protein synthesis stations offered approximately 800 options, organized by chemical composition rather than taste, because taste was apparently a provincial concern. There were dishes that glowed, dishes that moved, dishes that existed in states of matter that Earth physics had no names for, and one station that appeared to be serving what could only be described as weaponized aromatic compound. The human-compatible section offered something the database translated as nutritionally complete biological fuel, which looked like brown paste and tasted like sap. "This is going to be a long year," her companion observed, poking at the paste with what the cafeteria provided as standard utensil number 7. "Could be worse," the protagonist replied, watching a student from a species with 17 manipulator appendages juggle their food while simultaneously reading from 3 different data tablets. "We could be expected to do that." They ate in silence, surrounded by the ambient noise of 200 species all having dinner and discussing the day's events in languages that ranged from supersonic to subsonic, punctuated by the occasional bout of what the translator helpfully labeled as aggressive academic debate. Tomorrow, classes would begin. Tomorrow she'd walk into advanced survival protocols and attempt to prove that humanity belonged here, that Earth's newest generation could keep up with species who'd been navigating the stars when humanity was still figuring out which end of the spear was pointing. Tomorrow, the real work would start. Tonight she finished her sad paste, returned to her gray room, and tried very hard not to think about how the nearest human being outside this station was approximately 47 light-years away, how Earth was a pale blue dot even the station's telescope struggled to locate, and how she was representing an entire species who'd barely figured out interstellar travel and were now trying to pretend they belonged in a classroom with civilizations that had been doing calculus when Earth was still cooling from formation. She set her alarm, adjusted the sleeping platform to something resembling comfortable, and closed her eyes. The Galactic Institute of Advanced Learning continued its rotation through the void, indifferent to the anxieties of one particular human student, as it had been indifferent to the anxieties of billions of students before her from hundreds of species, all of whom had probably felt exactly this overwhelmed on their first night, all of whom had somehow survived to tell the tale, probably, hopefully. The statistics were unclear on that point, and she'd decided not to look them up. Advanced Survival Protocols was held in what the course catalog described as a dynamic learning environment, which turned out to be a circular amphitheater, where the floor could apparently transform into any terrain the professor deemed education. Currently it was pretending to be floor, which seemed like a waste of good holographic technology,
But the protagonist wasn't complaining. She'd take solid ground while it lasted. The professor arrived precisely on time, which was impressive considering the professor was a crystalline entity that moved by rearranging its molecular structure in a way that looked like walking but probably involved physics. Earth hadn't quite figured out yet. It stood at the center of the amphitheater, refracting light into patterns that the translator assured everyone was the professor's name, but which came across as something like harmonious frequency in the key of survival, which seemed both poetic and incredibly extra. "Greetings, students," the professor said, its voice emerging from vibrations in the air itself. "You have been selected for this course because your species has demonstrated sufficient capability to engage with scenarios that would terminate lesser civilizations. This is not a compliment. This is a baseline expectation." Well, that was encouraging. The class consisted of 37 students from 22 different species. The protagonist recognized a few from orientation. The geometric entity that had informed her humanity should be a pair of insectoid beings whose species name translated to something unprintable, and a tall, elegant creature covered in what appeared to be decorative fungi that pulsed with bioluminescence. Everyone looked competent and confident, which meant everyone was probably faking it as hard as she was. "Today's exercise," the professor continued, its crystalline structure shifting to project a holographic display above its form, "is a standard survival assessment. You will be presented with a scenario, you will propose solution. I will evaluate whether your species deserves to continue participating in interstellar commerce, or should perhaps return to your home systems and reconsider your life choices." The protagonist was beginning to suspect this professor had tenure and no longer cared about student evaluation. The hologram expanded, filling the center of the amphitheater with a three-dimensional rendering of a spacecraft. Not a modern vessel, but not ancient either, something middle-range, the kind of ship that probably got used for cargo runs and passenger transport on routes considered mostly safe. "The scenario," the professor announced, "is as follows. You are crew aboard this vessel. A collision with uncharted debris has damaged your primary engines, your communication array, and your navigation systems. You are stranded in a region of space with elevated radiation level. Your life support will fail in approximately 43 standard hours. The nearest inhabited system is 60 hours away at maximum velocity, which you cannot achieve with damaged engines. Supply pods contain standard emergency equipment. Propose your survival strategy." The hologram updated, showing the damaged sections in red, the dwindling resources in amber, and the hostile radiation in what could only be described as angry purple. It was, the protagonist had to admit, a thoroughly unpleasant situation. Also entirely theoretical, which meant everyone could pontificate about proper procedures without the inconvenient pressure of actual death. The geometric entity went first, naturally. Its solution involved a 17-step protocol that began with established command hierarchy, according to Axiom collective regulations, and ended with await rescue while maintaining optimal resource allocation. It presented charts. It had calculation. It had clearly done this exact exercise before, possibly multiple times, and had the entire thing memorized down to the specific page numbers in whatever manual its species considered authoritative. The professor's crystalline structure flickered in what might have been approval or might have been intense boredom, hard to tell with living mineral. Next came one of the insectoid students, who proposed using the ship's remaining power to send a focused distress beacon, then entering species-specific hibernation states to reduce resource consumption. Sensible, efficient, probably required biology that didn't apply to half the species present, but points for thinking about it. The fungi-covered being suggested redistributing power from non-essential systems, recalibrating the engines for lower output but higher efficiency, and establishing a repair rotation to fix critical systems while minimizing radiation exposure. It had clearly paid attention during the prerequisite engineering courses and wasn't afraid to show off. Other students proposed variations on these themes: wait for rescue, fix the engines, minimize consumption, send signals. All perfectly logical, all thoroughly predictable, all assuming that proper procedure and adequate planning would somehow overcome the fundamental problem that they were thoroughly screwed. The professor called on the protagonist with what felt like deliberate timing, right after the most technically elaborate solution had been presented by a student, whose species had been spacefaring for 6,000 years, and had apparently never encountered a problem they couldn't solve with sufficient mathematics. "Human student, your proposed solution." Every sensor, eye, and visual organ in the amphitheater turned toward her. She stood, because sitting while presenting felt wrong even if half the class didn't have legs, and pulled up her own holographic workspace. So 43 hours until life support fails, 60 hours to the nearest help, damaged engines. The math says we die, so we need to change the math. She highlighted the damaged engine section. The collision damaged the engines, but the debris field is still there. We go back into it. The geometric entity made a sound the translator labeled as confusion approaching concern. We harvest materials from the debris, she continued, ignoring the reaction. Metal plates, power cells, anything we can grab, use them to build a heat shield around the inhabited section. Won't be pretty, won't be regulation, but it'll block some of the radiation, which means life support lasts longer. That is not proper procedure, the ancient species student interjected. Debris fields are navigational hazards. Approaching them with damaged systems is explicitly prohibited by regulations written for ships that aren't currently dying, the protagonist finished. Next we strip the non-essential sections completely. Not just power down, I mean physically remove panels, wiring, anything we can use. Cannibalize the cargo bay, the recreational areas, the backup systems, use it all to jury-rig engine repairs. Won't get us to full power, but maybe we can push 70%. She manipulated the hologram, showing the ship getting progressively more skeletal, as components were removed and repositioned. It looked less like a proper spacecraft, and more like something held together with determination, and possibly duct tape. If the galactic community had invented duct tape yet, they probably had something better. She'd use duct tape anyway. The radiation is still a problem, she continued. So we plot a course that uses the system's asteroid field as a radiation break. Longer route, more navigation required, but it keeps us in shadow from the worst exposure. And we don't send a standard distress signal because we don't have the power. Instead, we use the remaining fuel in the damaged sections to create a controlled burn. Make ourselves visible, not elegant, not efficient, but anyone looking will see a bright spot where there shouldn't be one. The amphitheater was quiet, not the good kind of quiet where everyone was impressed. The awkward kind where everyone was trying to figure out if what they'd just heard was brilliance or insanity, and strongly suspecting insanity. The professor's crystalline structure rotated slowly, refracting light in patterns that might have been contemplation. You would deliberately enter a debris field with damaged navigation. You would dismantle your own vessel. You would plot a longer course with failing systems. You would set fire to your own fuel. Your solution violates approximately 47 different safety protocols and assumes a level of improvisation that most species would consider reckless. Yes, the protagonist agreed, because there wasn't much point in arguing with accurate assessments. And if your improvised repairs fail, if your heat shield is insufficient, if your course calculations are incorrect, then we die slightly differently than we would have by following proper procedure and waiting for rescue that won't arrive in time. The professor's structure flickered through several colors before settling back into its default translucent state. Your solution is statistically unlikely to succeed. It relies on factors that cannot be adequately calculated. It assumes adaptation capabilities that standard crew training does not provide. It is, by all established metrics, a poor survival strategy. The protagonist sat down, accepting what was clearly going to be a failing grade on the first day. Fantastic. Her parents were going to love hearing about this. However, the professor continued, and the protagonist's attention snapped back. It is also the only proposed solution that demonstrated an actual attempt to survive rather than simply manage decline. This next class session will cover why most of you would be dead within 20 hours of an actual emergency. The amphitheater emptied with the usual chaos of 37 beings trying to exit through the same corridors while maintaining proper species-specific personal space requirements. The geometric entity floated past, its vocalization device broadcasting what was definitely judgment, reckless primitive methodology, typical human approach, chaos over calculation. The protagonist gathered her materials and headed for the exit, trying to decide if being called reckless and primitive in the same sentence was worse than just being called wrong. She was still contemplating this when the station's emergency alarms began screaming, and the floor stopped being theoretical.
The thing about emergency alarms on a space station housing 200 species is that they need to work across different auditory ranges, which means they work across all auditory ranges simultaneously. The resulting sound was less an alarm and more a physical assault on consciousness itself, accompanied by flashing lights in colors that shouldn't exist and probably violated several laws about sensory assault. The protagonist's temporal translator kicked in with helpful commentary. Catastrophic hull breach. Auxiliary wing 7, immediate evacuation protocols engaged. Remain calm. Panic is statistically counterproductive. The other students from advanced survival protocols were already moving, though moving was a generous term for what was happening. The geometric entity was rotating in place, presumably accessing emergency databases. The fungi-covered being had frozen completely, its bioluminescence flickering in what might have been distress. The insectoid pair were attempting to follow proper evacuation procedures, which involved forming an orderly line that approximately 30 other species were currently ignoring in favor of directed chaos. The station's structure shuddered, a sensation that should have been impossible in space but was happening anyway, which suggested something had hit them hard enough to overcome the stabilization systems. Not great. Definitely not great. The protagonist's visual feed updated with a schematic. Auxiliary Wing 7, where approximately 40 students had been in various laboratory sessions, was now experiencing rapid decompression, radiation leak, and what the station AI delicately termed structural integrity concerns. The blast doors had sealed, which meant those 40 students were trapped in a section that was becoming progressively less compatible with continued existence. Faculty members were responding, naturally. Protocols were being initiated. Rescue teams were assembling with all the speed of institutional bureaucracy that had been designed by committee across multiple species, which was to say they'd probably arrive in approximately 20 minutes, by which point the trapped students would be dealing with problems that made theoretical survival scenarios look pleasant by comparison. The amphitheater was emptying toward the designated safe. The protagonist was moving in the opposite direction before her conscious mind had fully registered the decision. Toward Auxiliary Wing 7. Toward the problem. A faculty member, something avian with feathers that shifted through prismatic colors, blocked her path. Student, evacuation is mandatory. Proceed to safe zone immediately. There are students trapped in Auxiliary 7. Rescue protocols are engaged. Professional teams will handle the situation. Your presence would be a liability. The protagonist looked at the faculty member, then at the schematic still displayed in her visual feed, showing the trapped section's life support, counting down with cheerful precision. 22 minutes until atmospheric failure. 15 minutes until radiation levels reached lethal thresholds for most species present. With respect, Professor, professional teams are assembling in the main bay, which is 12 minutes from Auxiliary 7 at emergency speed, and they're going to spend 5 minutes assessing the situation before acting, which puts them at 17 minutes, which means everyone in that wing will be unconscious or dead before proper procedure gets them out. The avian professor's feathers rippled in what was definitely irritation. And you propose to do what, exactly? You are a first-year student with no emergency response training. I'm a human with a really poor sense of self-preservation, and approximately 12 minutes to prove that class wasn't a waste of time. She didn't wait for permission, mostly because permission clearly wasn't coming. The corridors toward Auxiliary 7 were empty, everyone else having demonstrated sufficient survival instinct to run away from the disaster rather than toward it. The emergency lighting cast everything in shades of amber and red, which was atmospheric but not particularly helpful for navigation. The blast doors to Auxiliary 7 were sealed, naturally. Large, metal, and designed to prevent exactly what the protagonist was attempting. A control panel beside them blinked with a message in 40 different languages, all variations on "Do Not Open." Hazardous conditions beyond this point. Authorized personnel only. She stared at the panel, then at the doors, then back at the panel. The doors were designed to resist unauthorized access. They were not, however, designed to resist someone with access to the maintenance tunnels, which ran through the station's infrastructure, like veins, and were generally ignored by everyone because they were cramped, uncomfortable, and required navigating in 3 dimensions without proper gravity. Perfect. The maintenance access was 3 corridors over, marked with a universal symbol for places students definitely should not go. She pried open the panel, which resisted briefly before surrendering to leverage and determination, and crawled in. The tunnel was exactly as unpleasant as advertised, narrow, dark, and filled with the kind of mechanical humming that suggested important things were happening in the walls and floors and you probably shouldn't touch them. The protagonist oriented herself using the schematic, which was easier in theory than practice when up was a suggestion rather than a fact. She emerged in Auxiliary Wing 7, through a maintenance hatch that opened into what had been a chemistry laboratory,
and was now a chemistry laboratory experiencing significant ventilation issues. The air was thin, getting thinner, and tasted like metal and ozone and bad decisions. 3 students were attempting to seal a crack in the outer wall using what appeared to be lab equipment and optimism. It wasn't working. Human student, one of them said, a being composed of what looked like liquid metal that held its shape through some process Earth physics would probably have opinions about. You should not be here. This area is compromised. Noted. How many students in this? 41 including yourself, which demonstrates poor mathematical reasoning on your part. Where are the others? The liquid metal being gestured toward the interior sections, attempting to manually restore life support. The impact damaged the primary system. We have attempted repairs following proper protocols. The situation continues to deteriorate. The protagonist looked at the crack they were trying to seal, at the equipment they were using, at the approach they were taking, methodical, careful, completely inadequate for a problem that was getting worse faster than proper procedure could fix it. Stop, she said. They stopped, mostly out of confusion. You're trying to seal the crack from the inside, which means you're fighting against decompression. Don't seal it. Cover it. She grabbed what looked like a flexible polymer sheet from a nearby supply cabinet. This won't stop the leak, but it'll slow it down. Use the lab's magnetic clamps to hold it in place. Not permanent, but we don't need permanent. We need 20 minutes. She didn't wait to see if they'd follow her suggestion, instead moving deeper into the wing. The other students were gathered around a life support terminal, attempting to reconfigure systems that had been designed to be user-friendly for maintenance crews and were currently being operated by students who understood the theory, but had never actually touched the hardware. The geometric entity from her class was there, naturally, rotating through what were probably proper diagnostic procedures. Human, your presence is unexpected and unwelcome. We are implementing standard repair protocols. How long until life support is restored? Estimated 37 minutes, assuming no additional complications. We have 15 minutes before everyone starts passing out. New plan. She pushed past the protests and looked at the terminal. The damage was obvious even without technical training. The primary processing unit was fried, probably from the radiation spike. The backup systems were online but not connecting properly. Standard procedure would be to replace the damaged components, recalibrate the entire system, and run diagnostics to ensure everything was functioning within acceptable parameters. They didn't have time for standard procedure. We're not fixing this, she announced. We're bypassing. That is not possible. The life support network is integrated. Bypassing primary controls would requires running a direct connection from the backup generators to the atmospheric processors, cutting out the damaged sections entirely. She was already pulling access panels, tracing conduits with her hands because the schematics were about as useful as poetry when you needed to actually touch the hardware. It'll be unstable, it'll probably violate every safety regulation ever written, but it'll work for long enough. The fungi-covered being from class stepped forward, its bioluminescence pulsing with what might have been understanding or might have been impending organ failure. Hard to tell. If you are incorrect, we will lose backup systems as well as primary. If I'm correct, we don't suffocate. I'll take those odds. She found the connections she needed, ripped out the damaged sections with more force than finesse, and started jury-rigging connections that were never meant to be connected. Wires that should have been carefully soldered got twisted together. Safety interlocks got removed entirely. The whole thing looked like it had been assembled by someone who'd learned engineering from action movies and spite. The system protested with warning messages in 17 languages. She ignored them and powered it on anyway. The atmospheric processors coughed, sputtered, and reluctantly began functioning. The air, which had been approaching theoretical concept status, started being air again. Not good air, not properly filtered, regulated, optimized, but air that contained oxygen in ratios compatible with consciousness, which was really all anyone could ask for. The other students stared at the terminal, at her improvised repairs, at the warning messages that were still scrolling past with increasing urgency about unauthorized modifications and safety violations. This is not proper procedure. The geometric entity no, the protagonist agreed, gulping air that tasted like burnt plastic and victory. But we're not dead, so I'm calling it a win. The official rescue team arrived 11 minutes later, which was actually impressive by institutional standards, and found Auxiliary Wing 7 in what their report would later describe as stable but unconventional condition. The students were alive, conscious, and surrounded by repairs that made the team lead visibly uncomfortable. One of them, a being whose species specialized in emergency response and had probably seen everything, took one look at the life support bypass and made a sound the translator refused to interpret. "Which one of you did this?" the team lead asked, gesturing at the mess of exposed wiring and unauthorized connections. Every student in the wing pointed at the protagonist. "Of course," the team lead muttered. "Human. Should have. You're all coming with us for medical evaluation, and you," pointing at the protagonist specifically, "are coming with us for a very long conversation about station protocols and why they exist." The medical evaluation was thorough, tedious, and involved more scans than seemed strictly necessary. The doctors, representing 5 different species and apparently competing to see who could be most concerned, declared everyone physically intact but emotionally traumatized, which seemed backwards given that everyone was handling things remarkably well except for one student who kept insisting they needed to file proper incident reports before accepting treatment. The conversation about protocols happened in an administrative office that seemed designed to make people feel small and regretful. 3 faculty members, including the crystalline professor from Advanced Survival Protocols, sat across from the protagonist in furniture that didn't quite accommodate any of their physiologies correctly, which suggested the office predated modern ergonomic standards by several centuries. "You violated direct orders from faculty," the administrator began, a being whose species name translated to something like keeper of rules and maintainer of order, which seemed on brand. "You accessed restricted areas. You performed unauthorized repairs on critical systems. You endangered yourself and potentially worsened the situation." The protagonist nodded, because all of those things were factually accurate. "You also," the crystalline professor interjected, its structure refracting light in patterns that might have been amusement, saved 41 students who would have otherwise experienced significant medical complications or death before proper rescue protocols could be implemented. "Your improvised repairs, while horrifying from an engineering standpoint, functioned adequately for their intended purpose." The administrator's expression, or whatever equivalent its species used, suggested this was not the support it had expected. "Professor, surely you cannot condone." "I condone nothing. I observe facts. The fact is that standard procedures, while designed for optimal safety, require time that emergency situations do not provide." The human student applied principles discussed in class approximately 40 minutes prior to the emergency. The application was crude, dangerous, and effective. Her approach could have failed catastrophically. Yes, as could waiting for proper rescue while atmospheric conditions deteriorate. Risk assessment requires evaluating all probable outcomes, not merely the ones that follow established protocols. The protagonist sat quietly, watching 2 faculty members debate her fate while the third, the avian professor who had tried to stop her evacuation, remained silent but attentive. Finally the avian spoke. The human student demonstrated initiative, technical capability, and willingness to accept personal risk for collective benefit. These are, theoretically, qualities we claim to value in students. Perhaps the issue is not that she violated protocols, but that our protocols assume all species approach emergency situations with equivalent methodologies. The administrator looked like it wanted to argue but couldn't find adequate grounds. "She will still face consequence. Unauthorized access to restricted areas cannot be ignored." "Agreed," the protagonist said, speaking for the first time. "I'll accept whatever consequences are appropriate, but I'd do it again. With respect, proper procedure is designed for situations with time. We didn't have time. Sometimes you need to do things wrong in order to do them fast enough." The meeting concluded with what the Institute called official reprimand, with acknowledgement of extenuating circumstances, which meant it would go on her record but wouldn't result in expulsion. She'd also been assigned additional safety training, which seemed ironic given she'd just completed an unscheduled practical examination in survival protocols, but bureaucracies were the same across every species apparently. The real surprise came 3 days later, when the crystalline professor pulled her aside after class. "Human student, your approach to the survival scenario, and subsequently to the actual emergency, has generated discussion among faculty. Your species demonstrates a capability that more established civilizations have, through advancement and safety protocols, largely eliminated: the capability to ignore common sense." The professor's structure flickered in what was definitely amusement now. The capability to function effectively when established systems fail. Most species, when confronted with impossible situations, attempt to make them possible through proper procedure. Humans appear to accept impossibility and proceed anyway through improvisation. It is inefficient. It is often dangerous. It is also remarkably difficult to teach. You're saying we're good at doing things wrong. I am saying you are effective at adaptation under suboptimal conditions. Your planet produced a species without natural advantages, without stable environment, without the evolutionary benefits that allowed other civilizations to develop in relative safety. You survived anyway through what you call improvisation, and what evolutionary biology would call desperate creativity. The protagonist considered this. So Earth's contribution to galactic civilization is that we're really good at making things up as we go. In less diplomatic terms, the galaxy has species with superior technology, superior intelligence, superior physical capabilities. What the galaxy has lacked, until recently, is a species that excels at solving problems that proper methodology cannot address. Welcome to your niche, human student. 2 weeks later, the course catalog updated. A new elective appeared: Human Improvisation Theory, Practical Applications of Inadequate Resources. The description noted it would cover creative problem solving under constrained conditions, with emphasis on techniques developed by species lacking technological or environmental advantages. The enrollment filled within hours, the protagonist attending her regular classes and trying to navigate the complicated social dynamics of being simultaneously the student who had broken multiple rules and the student who had saved 41 lives, found herself being approached by classmates with increasing frequency. They had questions. They wanted to understand the methodology. They wanted to know how humans could look at impossible problems and see solutions instead of proper procedure. She did her best to explain, though explaining improvisation was like explaining You developed it through necessity. You refined it through repeated exposure to situations where proper procedure wasn't available. You practiced it by accepting that sometimes doing things correctly meant doing them incorrectly by everyone else's standard. The geometric entity from her class, which had spent weeks treating her like an interesting specimen of primitive species, approached her after a particularly challenging exam. Human student, I have been evaluating your approach to problems. It remains statistically improbable. However, I concede it may have applications in scenarios where my species' methodology proves inadequate. I propose collaborative study, which was apparently how the Axiom Collective said, I was wrong, and you were right, and I'm not happy about it, but I'm intellectually honest enough to admit it. Sure, the protagonist said, just promise me one thing. What requirement do you propose? If we're ever in an actual emergency again, let me handle the improvisation, and you handle making sure I don't accidentally violate any laws of physics that really shouldn't be violated. The entity's geometric patterns shifted in what might have been agreement or might have been resigned acceptance. This seems a reasonable division of capabilities. The Galactic Institute of Advanced Learning continued its rotation through the void, its student body slightly more diverse in methodology than it had been at the semester's beginning, its faculty grudgingly acknowledging that perhaps there were multiple valid approaches to survive, and its emergency protocols under review, because apparently humanity's presence required updating safety standards to account for species that viewed rules as suggestions during crisis situations. And somewhere in a gray dormitory room, one human student finished her homework, looked out at the stars that Earth had only recently gained access to, and felt something that might have been belonging, or might have been the satisfaction of proving that sometimes the newest species in the classroom had lessons to teach the established civilized. Earth had said hello to the galaxy. The galaxy, somewhat reluctantly, was beginning to listen,